Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this afternoon session, and thank you very much for the introduction. I was just saying to Dr. Reed that I was deeply, deeply impressed by his the graphics on the cover, that combination of keyboard and hand grenade. I absolutely love it, and I'm afraid it's probably copyright protected by your publisher, because I know my cyber security guys in the organization would go bananas over this. I think it's brilliant. Before I get started, a quick comment, because otherwise you're probably all going to fall over backwards with the chairs. This presentation is somewhat text heavy. The reason being that because of the brief period of time, I would like to focus more on the question of corporate best practices, but to put things into perspective, have included some general material in the beginning. I'm just going to flip through those slides, especially introduction as to who Deloitte are. Anybody who would like a copy of the presentation is more than welcome. Please just provide me with your business card afterwards, and we're happy to send you that material. But I think it makes more sense to actually try and cover specific areas in some more depth rather than try and do the whole presentation straight away. I'm not actually looking at this from a cyber angle, but purely from a business, or if you want to put it like that, management and risk management angle. So I think it's a sort of I believe to a certain extent is complementary. I was delighted in having that topic of corruption mentioned in Mr. Dahl's opening statement this morning, where he made a side remark to the effect that, well, this whole corruption debate and could you no longer express your gratitude to somebody. Let me be very clear here. When we're talking about the phenomenon of corruption, we're not talking about gratitude. And I was thinking briefly how to illustrate that, and probably the example I would choose is, it's not corruption if you tip the taxi driver £10 because he was kind enough to drop you right in front of the hotel. It is corruption if you're queuing for a taxi and somebody 5 places down the line waves £10 at the taxi driver and steals your taxi. So this isn't about gratitude or acknowledging people's effort. It's about distorting the market, influencing the market, and ultimately, as we will see from some of the examples I'm going to pull up, this is likely to get companies into significant trouble, especially in today's day and age. For those of you who have not come across Deloitte and Touche, we are one of the infamous Big Four audit firms. We are actually the largest of the four on the global scale. We have about 193,000 people, give or take a few, operating worldwide, and of which the forensics department sits within the area of corporate finance, as you can see from the graphic on the right. What we do, we provide a range of services around dealing with economic crime, which includes internal fraud. It includes, and that's an overlap to Dr. Reed's earlier topic, investigation into espionage. I do quite a bit of counterintelligence work for some of our clients. We work frequently with security departments. And our area of activity extends from the one case investigation to the design of control systems, prevention and detection. And I'm going to look into the prevention, detection and response range a little later, up to the area of dispute and litigation services. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides. This is really more for I'll keep this briefly up on the screen because that's the 6 core areas of our activities. And there's a slide behind this for every single one of those areas if you want more details on that. Or if anybody's particularly interested in a particular topic, then please feel free to address that during the Q&A. I'm going through those here. And these are really the things I would like to cover today. First of all, and I don't have to tell many of you, the topic of bribery and corruption legislation is something that's increasingly shaping public debate. I know it's certainly something that's frequently in the public debate in India. It's also something that's coming up in many other countries. And there are probably several factors at work here, and I would single out 3 here. First of all, and most important, probably sadly though it is, sad though it is to say so, the international framework that expects countries to have an anti-bribery and corruption framework, the OECD convention, various UN conventions. Countries, to a certain extent, if they haven't addressed the problem, have to catch up. Second point, bribery and corruption, there's general agreement that it is something that should be fought and eradicated. And it is something that tends to be a vote winner. And there are a couple of examples. Kenya in the early noughties springs to mind, where elections have actually been won largely on the back of an anti-corruption agenda. And finally, there is a certain necessity for businesses to deal with these things, simply because there is an international framework pushed by a couple of countries, in particular the US and the UK, that necessitate changing standards even in regions such as Southeast Asia, certainly in the regions such as continental Europe. That brings me to my second point. One thing we have seen in the course of our work is that in many countries, businesses are still unaware of the regulatory framework and the sanctions risks they run. And let me expound on that point very briefly. The challenge today is that there are a couple of laws in place, in particular the relatively new UK Bribery Act, which came into force in 2011, and the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, usually abbreviated to FCPA, that essentially have global applicability. Now, I'm not going to comment from the political scientist point of view whether I think this is very desirable, but I think it is a fact of life. And one thing I can tell you as a provider of services is that if you're doing business with European or American multinationals, you are increasingly required to demonstrate that you dealt with that problem, especially if you operate in what these businesses consider high-risk jurisdictions. That has to do with what you could probably, from a political science point of view, call a trickle-down effect of responsibility. First of all, responsibility is pushed down from the public into the private sector, and now the private sector is pushing it on into vendors and business partners in emerging markets, saying that, yes, we are under the gun here, so you will be under the gun as well. One interesting question, and I would like to address very quickly address that here, and I should make it very clear that I don't have the answer, is whether we are actually at the end of the rope as regards this extraterritorial enforceability of laws. And personally, and I'm not speaking for Deloitte here, personally I don't think we are. I think one of the developments we have to consider for the next couple of years is that there may well be the equivalent of a regulatory arms race where you do not count as a proper power in this field unless you have anti-corruption laws that are also enforceable outside your own state. And one example is the People's Republic of China, which with its reform of the anti-bribery law, 2011, added a passage on making the bribery of foreign officials illegal. Now, to my understanding, that hasn't actually been prosecuted outside China yet. If somebody's here in a position to correct me, I'd be very happy for the input. But the important thing is that, for example, doesn't define at all what is considered a foreign official. We will only find out if and when a company is actually prosecuted under that. And the question is, for example, if the Indian anti-corruption, anti-bribery law is modernized and extended, will there be something on the bribery of foreign officials and or enforcement on that topic along the lines of, well, if you can do it to our businesses here, we should be able to do it to other businesses so as not to suffer a competitive disadvantage. And the third point, and that's simply adding to the complexity here, is that if you look at the recent market data over on the development of the various regions, intra-regional trade is becoming one of the more important drivers of growth. So you don't just have to deal with your counterparties in the US and their expectations, your counterparties in Europe, but you also have to deal with your counterparties in neighboring countries. And as I said earlier, as the anti-bribery, anti-corruption legal environment gets more complex, you need to find a way to do that. I've summarized the two laws very briefly here, and the thing I would like to point out here is that that both of them, under the requisite for liability, mean that you can also get into trouble if you're covered by those laws for willful blindness, expressly under the UK Bribery Act and effectively to a certain extent under FCPA, although that is looser. Now, the problem, if you are a service provider, if you're a vendor, is that companies this day and age tend to err on the side of caution when looking at their risk exposure there, and therefore are likely to expect their business partners to have appropriate systems and controls in place. The last point, the exceptions, I've really just added that because you will find it in much of the legal literature on the topic. Yes, there is a part of the FCPA that says that so-called facilitation payments, where essentially a payment is made not to cause an illegal act, but merely to speed up a legal act, would be okay. My understanding is, I'm not speaking as a lawyer here, that nobody has ever successfully argued that in court. So relying on those exceptions is probably not such a brilliant idea. I mean, there's a bit of a chicken and egg question here, as in, is it because only cases that are so big that you can't really talk of facilitation come to be prosecuted? Or is it that it just doesn't work? But I think that's just something to bear in mind, because quite a lot of people like to go on about that difference between the two acts. I've listed a couple of examples, and by the way, these are 4 cases from 2013. The list on the SEC website is quite illuminating, because one thing you will notice is that we're talking very different sectors here. If you are covered under this area, you have to be very, very careful. And if you're working with companies that are FCPA covered, you need to be aware that they are most likely, that this is something that's most likely going to be very much in the forefront of their mind. One important thing here, and that touches back on my earlier point about the question of defining a public official. As you've seen on the previous slide, the US FCPA refers to public officials only. The interesting question, and that's something that's currently still in the courts, is what is actually a public official for the purpose of the Act? Because historically, the assumption was that a public official would only be somebody who worked directly for a public entity. And in 2011, the SEC pretty much stunned the compliance world by stating that they would consider sovereign wealth funds, which manage the investment of public money, as, or the employees of sovereign wealth fund, public officials for the purposes of the FCPA. Now, personally, again, not speaking for Deloitte and Touche here, I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding or maybe an exaggeration, because it's essentially a sovereign wealth fund is an investment bank with a very limited client base. But if that is the view that's being taken, it presents a significant challenge, because it means that you have to look at an entire organization, pretty much down to people on the ground, as being public officials rather than a few people on the top. And that, of course, means that you have to, if you're covered by this, you have to look at your entire operations top down rather than just say, okay, we have limited interaction with these people. Now, on the question, what can you do about it? How can you demonstrate that you're taking this problem seriously? And I have divided that into the classic 3 areas of prevention, detection, and response. Let's go briefly through the things. Prevention, on the prevention side. A code of conduct that is actually communicated and that is demonstrably communicated to employees is one of the basic cornerstones of any compliance program. However, too many companies, in my experience, stop there. And that moves me to the second point of operational guidance, and I'm coming to the blacklisting in a minute. Simply having a 10-point code of conduct is probably not enough in today's world, because the guidance provided to employees needs to reflect the complexity of business operations, and there are very few things that can be managed with a couple of general rules. And leaving too much room for interpretation by employees and saying, well, we relied on our employees not breaking any laws and we just gave them this general guidance, probably won't work. So guidance on how to apply these rules, how to apply that code of conduct is going to be extremely important. And that may go so far as to actually exclude certain types of businesses or certain types of payment. I have at least one client who has a dedicated blacklist and saying that corporate-wide no transactions are permitted with entities in the following jurisdictions. And these are all offshore jurisdictions where ownership of companies and certain types of trusts is completely intransparent. Because the argument is there is no legal way of knowing who is the beneficial owner of a company. So that client of mine simply will not make any payments in those jurisdictions. And while this may be an extreme example, it certainly saves them from a lot of hassle to having to decide every time again that unfortunately it's not possible to find out who is behind a foundation in Andorra. Ongoing risk analysis. Check what areas you're in and what people you do business with. Even if you assume you're not in a particularly high risk environment, there are certain business sectors that are particularly corruption prone, and demonstrating an effort to actually look at the risk landscape is probably helpful. And also do your occasional cold-eyed neutral capability review. I can give you a practical example. We have just finished a project for a very large German multinational who asked us to look at their security capabilities across the whole of their organizations. And as part of that, we interviewed about close to 100 people, I think 95 or so, from the security function, from associated function, and from the stakeholder environment. And put together an overview, is this function dealing with the risks the way it should be dealing with them? Are they covering all the topics they should be covering? And doing that sort of thing on a slightly smaller scale is probably extremely useful. Doing it either internally using your corporate audit function or externally. Moving on to the subject of detection. Identify business activities that have an increased risk profile. I'm jumping between the points here a little bit. Targeted audits for indications of bribery and corruption. Data mining, where you take very large volumes of data and look for irregularities. A typical example, very simple example, would be scan for transactions into known offshore areas. And very important, a reporting system. If you're Sarbanes-Oxley covered, you have to have that anyway. But if you're serious about avoiding bribery and corruption, then having what's colloquially known as a whistleblower system is probably one of the smartest investments you can make. But only if you actually have a plan in place, and that brings me to the response bit, how you deal with any allegations. Because that's one of the worst things that can happen, that somebody reports the issue to you and you're then unable to follow up on it. So you should have investigative policies and procedures. You should have investigative capabilities. These can be internal or external. My recommendation is always, if you want to do it externally, which may make sense if, in many cases, then identify the provider before you have a problem, because that will actually give you a lot of leeway as to look at capabilities, rather than wait for the moment when you have a problem and then you have to find a provider and get the case solved. And general preparation for incidents along the lines of communications, legal issues. I'm always amazed how many companies will quite happily expand their business into new jurisdictions, and only a year later, when they actually have an issue, look at things such as how can we conduct an investigation? What is the legal privilege in this country? The assumption is always that this kind of knowledge gets sort of assimilated automatically once you're in a certain market. And let me tell you from experience, no, it does not. A company can quite happily do business for about 2 years in a market, something like that, without ever gathering the information they need to resolve a significant allegation. I've put my contact details on here. As I said, if anybody would like a copy of the presentation, very happy to send one out. Do drop me a line or hand me a business card afterwards. And I think we're well within the allocated time slot, so I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.